Do you know how many Pokémon spin-off games exist? Well, I do now. The answer is 64. But that's not the fact I'm here to tell you today. Instead, I'm gonna present to you one fact about each of these 64 spin-off games in Pokémon history. We're just gonna go crisscross through them all, starting on the Nintendo Wii with the two Poképark titles. The first, Pikachu's Adventure, introduces the logo of the series, but this is actually not the first time it's been used. It was also the logo for the real-life Poképark, a temporary theme park in Japan which both opened and closed in 2005. The game's sequel, Wonders Beyond, is the only Pokémon game on the Wii out of the total of 6 to be a part of Gen 5. All others are Gen 4 games, like, for example, My Pokémon Ranch, the most interactive storage game we've ever had. That said, we in the West never even got to enjoy a pretty significant part of the game's content, because it was Japan exclusive. I'm talking about the Platinum update, which added a ton of features on top of connectivity with Gen 4's third version, but only for Japanese players. New content included 500 more storage spaces, new forms for Rotom, Giratina and Shaymin, as well as new toys, music and animations for older Pokémon. The developers of the game were Umbrella, who have recently been absorbed into Creatures Inc. However, not before creating one of Pokémon's most prolific spin-off series, Pokémon Rumble. The first game debuted on WiiWare and is one of the only games in this video to feature shiny Pokémon. When encountered, they fortunately are automatically recruited and can as such not be missed. The series would continue with 2 entries on the 3DS, with one on Wii U sandwiched in between. The first of these was Pokémon Rumble Blast, and when I say first, I don't just mean in the Rumble series. Rumble Blast was the first Pokémon game to be released on the 3DS in general, releasing 2 whole years before X and Y. Similarly, Pokémon Rumble U was the first Pokémon game on the Wii U, but due to the failure of the console, it also ended up being the only exclusive Pokémon game on the system. After all, Pokken Tournament, which will get its fact later in the video, was originally an arcade title. Back on the 3DS, the series continued with Pokémon Rumble World, a free-to-play game with microtransactions. It was however released physically later down the line, making it the only Pokémon game that was available digitally first and became a retail title later. The series received one more entry before presumably dying as Umbrella became a part of Creatures Inc. called Pokémon Rumble Rush on mobile devices. That said, the game originally had a completely different title when it was released as a beta, not even bearing the Pokémon Rumble name. Instead, it was called Pokéland, which sounds more like a Poképark successor to me. Let's wrap up the rest of Umbrella's legacy before we move on, starting with their first ever game, Hey You Pikachu on Nintendo 64. Contrary to popular belief, saying Sony or PlayStation into the game's microphone will not cause Pikachu to get angry. However, if you want to piss off your electric friend regardless, you can just call him a rat. That does get him angry. The game received a spiritual successor on the GameCube called Pokémon Channel, mostly remembered nowadays for the Jirachi event. Now, if you've gone down a Pokémon YouTube rabbit hole before, you may know this Jirachi can actually be shiny too, when received in Ruby or Sapphire, but if you didn't, well, now you know. It may not look it at first, but Pokémon Dash is probably supposed to be the third entry in this sort of mini-series. It features similar Pet Your Pikachu mechanics and was made by Umbrella as well, so it's next up on the list. Because the game itself is unfortunately pretty bad, we have to look at another game for a Dash fact. In the aforementioned My Pokémon Ranch, it's actually possible for the special Dash event to occur, which is a race, if you have Bulbasaur, Pikachu, Meowth, Teddiursa and Munchlax in your ranch at the same time. Let's go to another big spin-off series, arguably even the biggest, Pokémon Mystery Dungeon. The series debuted on GBA and DS simultaneously, with Red and Blue Rescue Team, and were later remade on the Switch with Pokémon Mystery Dungeon Rescue Team DX. This makes these games the only non-main series ones to have ever got a remake. If that doesn't show the status of Mystery Dungeon, I don't know what does. This series would continue on the DS with the sequels, Explorers of Time and Darkness. These games of course heavily improved on the originals, but one change you may have missed is that they gave almost every character genders, even those that don't have genders in the main games, like legendaries. This was not the case in Red and Blue Rescue Team. Not long after, the third version was released, Explorers of Sky, often considered the best in the series. It added various new elements to the game, including some dungeons like Sky Peak, but that one actually was already present in the files of Explorers of Time and Darkness, but was only used for tests and not in the final game. Surprisingly enough, this game was followed up by 3 Japanese exclusive titles on WiiWare. These are Pokémon Mystery Dungeon, Keep Going, Blazing Adventure Squad, Let's Go Stormy Adventure Squad, and Go For It Light Adventure Squad. These versions are completely different from one another and have different Pokémon included, as well as different dungeons. They're also the only games in the series to not start with a quiz to decide the player's Pokémon. Next, we arrive on the 3DS, which received 2 entries. The first is Gates to Infinity, which is the only title in the series to feature Pokémon in the game that cannot be recruited. This was undone in the follow-up Super Mystery Dungeon, which featured all the then existing Pokémon in the game, as well as various recognizable faces and even dungeons from previous entries. Weirdly enough though, the game actually has a higher age rating than all previous games in the series. Instead of ages 3, it's now ages 7. Let's stick around on the 3DS for a while, looking at several loose titles released on the system. We're gonna start with Pokémon Art Academy, a crossover between those two series. As such, this is the first Pokémon game to be developed in Europe, in the UK to be specific, where developers Headstrong Games are from. The next entry may not technically be a game, but I'm counting it anyways, being Pokédex 3D Pro. This digital Pokédex features all Pokémon that existed at the time, being the first 5 generations, but 2 actually needed to be unlocked. These were the mythicals of Gen 5, Genesect and Meloetta. You can unlock them by creating a quiz and then using a password. Onto a very forgotten 3DS title, the Japan exclusive, The Thieves and the Thousand Pokémon. Sounds like that game would be more fitting nowadays, huh? That said, the title is a reference to the story of Ali Baba and the 40 Thieves, which is a part of 1001 Nights. Next is Pokémon Dream Radar, the game where Professor Burnett originates from, albeit with a pretty different design. This game may be a 3DS title, but tied into Pokémon Black and White 2, and was released on the exact same day. It was even developed by Game Freak themselves, which can even bring up questions whether this is a spin-off at all. Next is Pokémon Picross, another neat little puzzle game released in 2015. That said, it could possibly have come a few decades earlier, as a cancelled Pokémon Picross game was announced for Game Boy Color in 1999. The developers of the 2 games were even the same, a company called Jupiter Corporation. Another downloadable 3DS title is Pokémon Shuffle, which later got a re-release on mobile. And interestingly enough, out of all games in the Pokémon franchise, this one has the most available Pokémon. A total of 802 species can be obtained in this game, which beats every other main series game or spin-off. Small step from Shuffle to the short-lived Pokémon Trozei series, which debuted on the Nintendo DS. If you're like me and you've always wondered what Trozei even means, boy do I have a fact for you. Trozei is not an actual word, it's a romanization of Trozei, which is Japanese for let's get it, and the title of the game over there. Europe didn't want to mess around with translations though, and simply called the game Pokémon Link. And that new title was kept when the game got a sequel on 3DS, called Pokémon Battle Trozei, or Link Battle if you're in Europe or Australia. The game was released digitally in March 2014 in all regions, but you could actually buy game cards, which had a code on them, in Japan a few days prior to release. Just found it kinda interesting they would have something like that for such a small title. Believe it or not, this little series was actually developed by Genius Sonority, who are better known and loved for the 2 Shadow Pokémon or Ore titles, whichever you prefer, on GameCube. First was Pokémon Colosseum, released in 2004. This is a super interesting title, unique in so many ways, down to even your starting Pokémon, Espeon and Umbreon. Now, these titles can connect to Ruby and Sapphire, meaning you can send them over, but they cannot be used to breed yourself some more Eevee. After all, these Espeon and Umbreon are hard-coded to always be male. Only a year later, the game received a sequel, XD Gale of Darkness. That said, someone forgot to tell Nintendo of America president Reggie Fils-Aimé that, because he said at E3 that this was a completely original title, a follow-up to Ruby and Sapphire instead of Pokémon Colosseum. Fast forward another 2 years and Genius Sonority released their next title, Pokémon Battle Revolution, this time on the Wii. Even today, the animations and details of this game still receive compliments, and for good reason. Another crazy detail is that the animation for decreasing the HP bar when hit by an attack changes depending on the type of attack used. Such a cool little thing that. And of course, there's only one place to go from here, all the way back to the Nintendo 64 to cover the 2 Pokémon Stadium titles. The original title suffers a lot from early series growing pains, and has a lot of weird little things going on that would never happen in modern titles. One example where it was actually ahead of its time was with some of the nicknames. In this game, Team Rocket Grunts use Pokemon nicknamed with numbers, which wasn't possible at the time in the main series and would not be available until Generation 3. An interesting fact about Pokemon Stadium 2 is that it's actually the largest game on Nintendo 64, tied with Conker's Bad Fur Day and Resident Evil 2. That said, it's only 64 megabytes, which is significantly smaller than the video you're watching now. Another iconic spin-off series that began on the Nintendo 64 is of course Pokemon Snap. The game features 7 levels, but this was originally supposed to be more. One we know for a fact was cut was a ghost-themed level. However, since Gen 1 only has 3 ghost Pokemon, it's not that hard to understand why it ended up unused. It took over 20 years, but the game finally received a sequel in 2021 on the Nintendo Switch titled New Pokemon Snap. This game actually has a little crossover promotion with the movie Secrets of the Jungle. Pictures from the movie appear in Professor Mirror's lab, while Rita and Phil both have a cameo in the movie. Speaking of movies, let's cover the 2 Detective Pikachu games next. The original Nintendo 3DS is actually the last Pokemon game to be released on the system, in 2018, 1 year after the Nintendo Switch had already been released. The Switch would eventually get the game's sequel, Detective Pikachu Returns. I say eventually because there were 4 entire years between the announcement and release of the game, which is the longest ever for a Pokemon game as far as I was able to tell. Next, we're gonna cover the many Pokemon titles available on mobile, starting with the most successful one of all, Pokemon Go. A bit of forgotten history of this title is that it's actually based on an April Fool's joke collaboration between Google and the Pokemon Company. On April 1st, 2014, 2 years before Go's release, you could catch Pokemon on Google Maps, not too dissimilar to what ended up becoming Pokemon Go. As any player of the game would know, Pokemon Masters X has a bit of a weird relationship with the main series games. Many events from the main series games are said to have transpired in this universe as well, and the game is set after the stories of all games. And yet, Red is the only playable character in the game to be confirmed as champion, even though plenty of other events referenced in the game happen after that game's player has already won the title of champion. A significantly less popular mobile game as these two is Magikarp Jump. Various elements of the game were inspired or even straight lifted from Survive Mola Mola, the previous game of developers Select Button. This game also revolves entirely around a fish, albeit without the catching theming. Select Button is also responsible for Pokemon Sleep, which has an interesting fact concerning its release date. As far as I can tell, this is the only game in the entire series to be released in Japan and the United States last. The rest of the world was already sleeping away with their Pokemon, while usually the most important audiences for the series had to wait. Next is one of the few Pokemon mobile games to not have any transactions in them, Pokemon Smile. When first booting up the game, players receive their first Pokemon, but this Pokemon is actually not registered in the game's Pokédex. Instead, it has to be caught like all other Pokemon in the game in order to be registered. Well, that's all exclusive Pokemon mobile titles. There are a few that are available on both mobile devices and the Nintendo Switch, like the Pokemon MOBA Pokemon Unite. While the Pokemon sounds in the game itself are the familiar game sounds, the intro actually uses the anime sounds for all Pokemon. And this is actually not dubbed into English, meaning the Pokemon use their Japanese voices from the anime. Pokemon Quest never really found its footing in the West, but it is extremely popular in China. And the Isle of Armor apparently, because Mustard can be found playing the game while relaxing at the Master Dojo. It also means it's the only spin-off title to be an actual game within the Pokemon universe as well. And then there's Pokemon Cafe Mix, which may not be the most popular mobile game of all time, but it did receive its own manga adaptation, all the way back in 2022. There's only one entry, but it's more than most spin-offs ever get. On to some other puzzle titles, which have that word in their very name. First, the Nintendo 64 game Pokemon Puzzle League, a reskin of Panel the Pawn. The game is heavily based on the Pokemon anime, but interestingly enough, they did fix one weird inconsistency. Previously, Lorelei had been referred to as Prima in the anime, but her name is kept accurate in this game. This style of puzzle games also received an entry on the Game Boy Color, Pokemon Puzzle Challenge. That said, the game was originally called Pokemon Attack, a reference to Tetris Attack, which is the style of Pokemon game it's based on. Another spin-off released on the GBC was the original Pokemon Pinball. As you might expect, this game pulls its dex entries from Pokemon Red and Blue. What else? But interestingly enough, they improved the punctuation. Every dex entry now ends with a dot, which wasn't the case in the original game. The game of course received a sequel on GBA focused on Ruby and Sapphire, meaning it packs the pinball table full with Hoenn Pokemon. Kecleon also has a prominent role as a bonus stage, where you must hit it while it's invisible. However, its red stripe also becomes invisible in this game, which is not supposed to happen. Let's move on to the Nintendo DS, starting with what I would consider the most underrated Pokémon game ever, Pokémon Conquest. This is a spin-off with Nobunaga's Ambition, a tactical strategy RPG. That said, this game actually killed another potential spin-off between Fire Emblem and Pokémon. Had this game not existed, Tokyo Mirage Sessions, a crossover between Fire Emblem and Persona, would have been a crossover with Pokémon instead. A bit of a weirder spin-off on the DS was Pokémon Typing Adventure, also developed by Genius Sonority actually. The game teaches kids how to type using Pokémon names, but that does mean some Pokémon had to be cut from the European release. Surskit, Staravia, Heatmore and Ferrothorn all have special characters in their names in some European languages, prompting them to be cut. And you can't talk about the Nintendo DS without mentioning this spin-off series that defined the system really, Pokémon Ranger. The original title doesn't have a subtitle like its two follow-ups do, but it was originally slated to have one. It was announced as Pokémon Ranger The Road to Diamond and Pearl. The next game in the series was Shadows of Almia, although it wasn't called that on the Wii U Virtual Console. On there, it was misspelled as Shadow of Almia, and while I can't go online anymore to check, I don't think this was ever fixed. And then we have Guardian Signs, the final game in the series. This game was actually the first game in Pokémon history to make a separation between legendary Pokémon and mythical Pokémon, although they were called rare Pokémon in this game. Fans had already separated the two, but this was the first game that made it official. On to the arcade titles next, which means most of you guys have probably not even played these games. All but one perhaps, as Pokken Tournament did end up making its way to multiple home consoles even. The game is effectively a Pokémon version of Tekken, a fighting game as such, with a lot of playable Pokémon as well as support Pokémon, which can help you in battle. As such, nearly 60 Pokémon play a prominent role during battles. And yet, none of them are rock type. Crazy coincidence if you ask me. While Pokken may be a standalone game, arcades also got to have what is effectively its own exclusive series, which started with Pokémon Batrio. This game was actually the one to introduce free-on-free battles to the series, a few years before Gen 5 brought them to the main games. That's also where the name comes from. It's a portmanteau between battle and trio. All cabinets with the game were eventually replaced by its sequel, Pokémon Treda. This game introduced many elements from Gen 5 and 6, like Mega Evolution, and even got the Pokémon Z expansion the main Gen 6 games never received. Although Legend ZA means Kalos gets the last laugh after all, I guess. Next in the series was Pokémon Gaolei, which dialed the battles back to 2v2. This game focuses on new mechanics from Sun and Moon, like Z moves. And then finally there is Pokémon Mesastar, which, believe it or not, is the only game in the Pokémon series that contains Mega Evolution, Z moves, Dynamax and Terrestrialization in the same game. Put it like that and it's crazy this game is Japan exclusive. And then finally, we have 5 more games to cover, all focusing on the Pokémon trading card game. The first hails from 2000, the Game Boy Color game simply titled Pokémon Trading Card Game. When the game was re-released on Virtual Console in 2014, it was actually slightly altered, unlike most games on the service. The artwork for Jinx was made more purple, to align better with her current design and to avoid the controversy of the past. The game received a Japan-exclusive sequel a year later, subtitled The Invasion of Team GR. This was actually the first ever game to be released by the Pokémon Company, which was a newly founded corporation at the time. While Japan may have received its cool TCG RPG, the next game on the cards was a game exclusive to the West, Trading Card Game Online. In total, this game was developed by 5 different companies, none of which have done anything noteworthy with the Pokémon brand before or after. In 2023, the game was shut down, forcing players to move on to its sequel, Trading Card Game Live. However, some TCG expansions were lost with the transfer. While Live contains every card released since Black and White, Online also has those that were a part of the Heart Gold and Soul Silver expansions. And finally, what better way to end than with the only spin-off game that is yet to release. I'm talking about Pokémon Trading Card Game Pocket, slated to go live later this year, at the moment of writing at least. This game is developed by DNA, who have never worked on Pokémon before, but are still Nintendo's closest ally when it comes to mobile games. They've aided in the development of some of their most successful mobile titles, like Mario Kart Tour, Animal Crossing Pocket Camp and Fire Emblem Heroes, and now apparently have been allowed to focus on Pokémon as well. And that's one fact for every Pokémon spin-off game. Which is your favorite from the bunch? Let me know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, please consider giving it a like and subscribing to the channel to stay updated on all my future Pokemon content. For now, thanks for watching and enjoy the rest of your day.